Hello, I'd like to follow up on the Q&A 2024 series that I invited you to volunteer your questions for. And I noticed that several of your questions were specifically about the primary sources that I use to research for my videos. So what I'd like to do in this installment is go through a handful of my most important resources, the primary texts that I use and I consult in order to research for many of the videos that I produce, especially around the Nahuatl language and some of the materials that are and the themes that come from these Nahuatl primary sources. So in many cases, I try to consult the original Nahuatl, and this is an example. This is the Codex Chimalpopoca, which was composed shortly after the conquest in the 16th century. And this version by John Bierhorst has a transcript of the original Nahuatl. So I can look at some of these materials and translate for myself to give a transparent translation and then explain what the text means. And this is an important resource, not only because it has much of the original Nahuatl, but also it has very important content, such as the historical narrative, beginning with the Toltec and Chichimec ancestors of the Mexica and the other Aztec tribes. So it talks about the history of the Aztec nations, including the arrival at Tenochtitlan and the settlement and eventual expansion of these Aztec nations. It also has important myths around the creation of humanity, as well as the creation of the suns, the five-sun myth, the Leyenda de los Soles, which here is included in the original Nahuatl. So it has a very important historical and mythical narratives that I use recurrently in many of my works, especially about mythology and history from the Mexica's own perspective. So this is one of the most important Nahuatl primary texts that I use in my research for these videos. Another important Nahuatl resource, and I've talked about this in previous videos, such as, for example, talking about classical Nahuatl. This is the Mexica, or the classical Nahuatl grammar that was composed by Horacio Carochi in the 1645. And this edition by James Lockhart has incredible detail with many footnotes that go into further nuances about the Nahuatl grammar that look at contemporary dialects, other literary sources, and very critical analysis of the original text. And you can see that this too is synoptic. It has the original Spanish on one side and then the corresponding English translation. So you can see kind of like how Carochi composes like his ideas in his own words, and then Lockhart's translation on this side. And this is important because it is a comprehensive study of the details of the classical Nahuatl dialect, with with a lot of exploration of the composition of verbs and nouns, and how adjectives and adverbs are also composed or formed in the classical dialect. And this is also important because it preserves many of the vowel lengths and other markers that are often missing in colonial texts that try to transcribe the Nahuatl language. So, for example, which is the glottal stop, the saltillo, which is especially found, I would even say uniquely found in the classical dialect, but is often underrepresented in transcriptions. So sometimes it's there, but in other cases, it's difficult to figure out where it is. But this text goes through meticulous examples of how to mark for the saltillo and vowel length and other important details that are necessary for correctly reading the classical dialect of Nahuatl. And so this is another one of my most important sources, especially when I go into examples of classical Nahuatl and I attempt to transcribe them and translate them and even pronounce them for myself for the videos that I produce around the Nahuatl language. As far as rituals and religion that from the colonial Nahuatl period, this is one of my most important sources. And I've also talked about this source in some of my other videos. I have an entire video just about the content of the Treatise of the Heathen Superstitions, which was also composed in the colonial period in 1629 by Hernando Ruiz de Alarcón, who was looking at the folk Nahua rituals and spells and magic that were believed in or practiced in the rural communities in southern Morelos and northern Guerrero states, the so-called Tierra Caliente, in the beginning of the 17th century. And he was doing that, and Ruiz Alarcón was doing this because he was trying to point out that these, although the Nahua were professing to follow the Christian church, they were still practicing many of their original like heathen practices and idolatries. This was much of their traditional indigenous religious beliefs and rituals, and still maintaining a lot of the ritual language. So this is this provides, again, a synopsis of the, or an like a comparison of the original Nahuatl and translation by Ruiz Alarcón himself, followed by a more analytical and critical Nahuatl and English translation by the scholars. These are J. Richard Andrews and Ross Hassig, who have kind of analyzed and studied and compared the ritual content of these spells to what we know from other aspects of Nahua religion from the colonial period. And so this is a very important source of Nahua ritual language, as well as much of the symbolism and the objects that are used and mythically and magically transformed into instruments of power throughout the many examples here that include rites of divination, rites of empowerment, rites of protection, protection spells, and so on. So this is a very valuable resource for my the videos, because it not only has a rich trove of content about in the Nahuatl language, so I can use this as a literary, as a grammatical resource, but also a resource for talking about rituals, especially in among the commoners, among the folk communities. So we have a very important source, which I always have to kind of add with the caveat, the caution that we have to be careful with the ways in which this material was collected, because many of them were often provided or produced through very unethical methods that were involved coercion, extortion, deception, and so on. So we have to be careful with it. But I also think that it's important that we can also use these texts to reclaim the value of the ritual language and practices that are encoded in this ritual, in these ritual texts. So that is another one of the most important sources that I use. And speaking of colonial Nahuatl, here too, this was an encyclopedia that was composed in the 16th century by the famous Friar Bernardino de Sahagún, the famous Florentine Codex. And I use this version, the University of Utah edition, because here again, we have a transcription of the original Nahuatl, and then the corresponding English translation. So I can use, so if I want to provide my own translations, I can use the English here as a guide for for translating, but I would like to be able to consult the original Nahuatl as necessary. And this is the only one that I actually have in my own collection. I actually go often to the University of Texas, which has the full 12-volume set. So I will often go there on a weekend if I need to consult any of the other works that Friar Bernardino Sahagún compiled with assistance from many of the educated elite nobles from the Nahua of Tlatelolco, which is now in the northern part of Mexico City, back in the 16th century, to create this encyclopedia of the natural history and the social history of the Nahua, especially the Mexica of Tlatelolco and Tenochtitlan. And through this 12-book encyclopedia, look at the animals, plants, the gods, the myths, the rituals, the clothing, the professions, many other aspects of the natural, social, and spiritual worlds of the Mexica as the nobles remembered from before and after the period of the conquest. So this is, again, the only one that I have in my own collection, but I will often go to the University of Texas San Antonio campus and go to their library, because there they have the entire 12-book set. So I will go there if I need to continue to find more resources or more references that involve this very important, this invaluable source of information about the history of the Mexica from the perspective of the educated Mexica elite themselves. The last one that I want to talk about is the Codex Borgia, and this is not like a Nahuatl English translation, because the text in here is entirely pictographic. These are glyphs and images that together, if you are properly trained, you know how to understand how the rituals, the myths, and other aspects of the cycles of the sacred calendar are converging and coming together in order to say something about the presence of the sacred, the presence of the spiritual powers that guide and govern the flowings of the 260-day calendar. And there are many richly illustrated examples from this reconstruction by Giselle Diaz and Alan Rogers. So based on the dilapidated and often faded content from the original codex, the author and artist were able to reconstruct the many of the details with the and attempts to even rebuild not just the outlines, the shapes, the figures, but even the original color schemes. So we have here mythical narratives, events of priests and gods. We have very important cycles involving, for example, the 20 days of the Aztec calendar, or the Central Mexican calendar, because it was not just Aztec. There were many other Central Mexican civilizations, such as in Cholula, and also similar calendar schemes in Oaxaca that were using very similar glyphs to track the movement of the 20 days and combining them with the 13 numerics to create the product of the 260-day cycle in this ritual sacred calendar. This is also has some wonderful illustrations that very telling of the role of myth, the presence of the gods and the spirits. And this illustration is of Tezcatlipoca, the god of power, the god of destiny, and the god of authority. And here you can see the 20-day signs kind of situated around different parts of his body and his accoutrements. And I would like to do a video series just on this one picture so you can see an example of how intricate and elaborate these different illustrations are. And this particular codex is so valuable because it has such a diversity of different themes around the calendar, such as rituals, myths, the different units of time, such as the count of the 9 nights, the count of the full 20 days and their respective glyphs and the gods situated in each of them, the 13-day periods. And so there are multiple levels of time, each with its own stationed divinities or gods and spirits that are associated with particular points along this. And this is an opportunity to go to one of the specific questions that I was asked in this Q&A. And this is about the cardinal direction. So I wanted to point to plate 72 of the codex, and I will put up a still that by which I can kind of go into more detail without having to hold this one up. But you can see that each of these quarters represents a cluster of the 5 days, and each of the days is each of these 5 day sets is associated with a different cardinal direction. So here, for example, in the bottom right, we have a wind, death, dog, flint, and jaguar, and these are all associated with the north. Here are the figures associated with the east. They are the caiman, the serpent, the reed, movement, and the water. So here we have, so each of these has its own assemblage of day signs that are associated with different cardinal directions. So I will put up a I'll put up a still from the Codex that further outlines the different day signs and which cardinal directions they are especially associated with. And we can corroborate this. In fact, the Florentine Codex actually talks about some of the examples of the different spiritual forces that are associated with these same calendar directions. So we have other textual references that can be used to clarify what is going on in the contents of the Codex Borgia. I also wanted to say one last thing because I had a question. One of the questions that I got in this Q&A session was about the Tezcatlipoca, and specifically some of the different nicknames that were associated with him. I, in fact, have an entire video about the nicknames and the monikers, other famous titles that were related to this very important god of Central Mexico. But this question specifically asked about Ipal Nemohuani, which means by his grace, by whose grace there is life. That life exists. There is the condition of living. That is what Nemohuani means. And I'm going to put up I'll post here a link to a Nahuatl dictionary that actually lists a number of different references, different sources that where we find instances, references to this particular name. So, for example, I believe Chimalpain is one of the sources that that mentions this specific name of Tezcatlipoca. But one that the dictionary does not list that I thought was very interesting is in the book A War of Witches. This is a very important book because it details shamanic practices in the 1970s as documented by the author Timothy Knab, who actually had many of his own experiences by learning from a couple of elderly shamans from the Puebla region, the Sierra region of northern Puebla, back in the 1960s and 1970s. And through his own investigation and research, he was able to uncover a blood feud that had taken place back in the 1920s and 30s in that area that was based on conflicts over how to use land as a new landlord, as a new hacienda baron was coming in and forcing the natives to replace their traditional corn subsistence with coffee plantations. And this led to a blood feud, like a kind of a factional war within the communities that nearly broke it apart. And he began to piece this together through not only conversations with some of the elderly figures, but also his own shamanic experiences by going into the spirit worlds and uncovering some of these dirty little secrets for himself. So he was able to reconstruct this kind of like a history that nobody was willing to talk about because it was such a sensitive and painful subject to recollect. But in this work, there is a reference to Ipal Nemohuani, which this is one of the only times I have seen a contemporary dialect of Nahuatl referenced this name. So it was interesting to see that it was continued into the present day because other cases are not recognized. I actually, when I was doing my field work in Veracruz back in 2004 and 2005, I actually went to another town in the Huasteca area. This is in North Veracruz, where there are still many contemporary Nahuatl speakers who speak Eastern Sierra Nahuatl. And I noticed that at one of the schools in one of the nearby towns, the name of the school was Tloque Nahuaque. Well, and again, we need that saltillo to pronounce it correctly from the classical. So it would be Tloque Nahuaque. So you have that saltillo, which in the suffix indicates that he is the possessor of. So this is the one who owns all that is close and all that is near. That is what Tloque Nahuaque means. And I actually tried to volunteer this to my host when I was living in the Nahua villages in that part of northern Veracruz, and he didn't recognize it. There have been 500 years of a disconnect with the original Mexica and other Nahua nations, that many of the myths and rituals from before the conquest had been lost because of the evangelization and because of all the cultural changes that they had undergone over 5 centuries. So my host didn't recognize that. He didn't. It didn't sound like Nahuatl to him. It sounded like another one of the indigenous languages, namely Huasteco, which is what they call Tenec, which is actually a Mayan language, which that broke off from the other Mayan languages about 4,000 years ago. But in any case, the host did not recognize Tloque Nahuaque as Nahuatl. So although it originally referred to one of the most important gods of the Mexica and other Nahua nations, the other Aztec nations from before the conquest, it no longer sounded like Nahuatl to the contemporary speakers. So that is something that is a precaution that you have to take, that sometimes you do find many interesting survivals of of indigenous ritual, language, and practice. But in other cases, the concept may still be there, even though the Nahuatl names for them may have been altered or changed. So this is something that I always have to kind of maneuver when I'm looking at the modern practices of these very ancient indigenous traditions. And this is my segue into the third and final installment for the 2024 Q&A, where I will talk more about how I bring many of these insights into my own practice and those that I think are worth sharing with you here in the channel. So I'm going to cut this off now because I'm losing my voice, and I look forward to concluding with more talk about how these lessons that I have gained from the fieldwork and from my research can be applicable, or how I apply them in my own daily practice, as well as those that I think are most valuable sharing here on the channel. So I look forward to talking further in the final installment of this Q&A series.